From a governor literally standing in a doorway to block two college students from registering for class, to a senator who killed every civil rights bill in America for 20 years, just by sticking them in his desk drawer, to a state that didn't officially abolish slavery until February 2013. This is Alabama and Mississippi explained. The Thank God for duo. Two states locked in the longest, ugliest race to the bottom in American history. A rivalry so consistent that Alabamians coined an actual phrase for it. Thank God for Mississippi. 'Cause whenever Alabama finishes 49th, at least somebody's 50th. But let's rewind, 'cause statistical disasters this big don't just pop up overnight. They simmer. They stew. And by the time the 21st century rolled around, the gap between these two states and the rest of America had become a chasm. 'Cause here's a fact most people don't know. Mississippi and Alabama joined the Union back-to-back. Mississippi got in on December 10, 1817. Alabama followed 2 years later on December 14, 1819. Twin sisters from day one. And get this, in 1860, Mississippi was, statistically speaking, the wealthiest state in the entire United States by per capita wealth. Alabama wasn't far behind. So how do you go from sitting at the top of the country to sitting at the bottom of every chart for the next 160 years? Well, the answer is uncomfortable. That wealth wasn't really wealth, at least not for most of the people who lived there. 'Cause in 1860, Mississippi had roughly 437,000 enslaved people. That's 55% of the entire state. Alabama had 435,000, about 45%. The economy of both states ran on cotton, and cotton ran on the backs of human beings. So when the Confederacy was being assembled in February 1861, where'd they hold the convention? Montgomery, Alabama. Who'd they pick as president? Jefferson Davis, a Mississippi planter and senator. Both states didn't just join the Confederacy, they were the Confederacy. And then they lost. The war ended in 1865. The plantation economy collapsed overnight. And both states never recovered. Like ever. We're talking 160 years and counting. But this whole century-and-a-half-long collapse makes a lot more sense when you look at who was running the show. 'Cause on the Alabama side, looming over the entire 20th century, stood George Corley Wallace, a former bantamweight boxer turned circuit judge turned governor, born in Clio, Alabama in 1919. The dude was small, scrappy, and absolutely obsessed with winning. Now here's the wild part. Wallace actually started his career as a relative moderate. He even refused to walk out of a 1948 Democratic convention with the segregationist Dixiecrats. But after he lost his first run for governor in 1958 to a more openly racist opponent, Wallace turned to an aide and reportedly said, "I will never be out-segregated again." Sir, that is an insane sentence to say out loud. From that point on, the dude was all in. And on January 14, 1963, at his inauguration, he delivered the most infamous line in modern American politics. Segregation now. Segregation tomorrow. Segregation forever. Sir, you might want to dial that back a notch. On the Mississippi side, the architect of the resistance wasn't a fiery governor. It was a slow-talking, cigar-chomping cotton planter from a town called Doddsville named James Oliver Eastland. Born in 1904, served in the U.S. Senate for 36 years, and ran his family's 5,800-acre plantation the entire time. And here's why he mattered. Eastland was the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which means every single piece of civil rights legislation in America had to cross his desk first. Eastland's strategy? He just didn't move them. For 20 years, he sat on bill after bill in committee until they died. Eastland once called the Brown v. Board decision the greatest single blow that has ever been struck against constitutional government in the United States. Cool, dude. Real chill take. Now, Wallace and Eastland weren't just two politicians. They were the system. The same system that had been quietly, methodically engineering this race to the bottom since the day the Civil War ended. 'Cause here's the part most history classes skip. Reconstruction actually worked. For a brief, shining moment after the Civil War, Black Mississippians and Alabamians voted, held office, and served in Congress. Mississippi sent the first two black senators in American history to Washington, Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce. Alabama elected 3 black congressmen. It was actually happening. But by 1875, the political class in Mississippi had launched what became known as the Mississippi Plan, a coordinated campaign of voter intimidation that effectively ended Reconstruction in the state. And by 1890, Mississippi held a constitutional convention with one stated purpose. The convention's own president said it out loud. "We came here to exclude the Negro." My guy, you're not even hiding it. So they invented poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. Black voter registration in Mississippi crashed from over 130,000 to fewer than 9,000 in just a few years. Alabama looked over, took notes, and copied the entire playbook in their 1901 Constitution. By 1903, black voter registration in Alabama had dropped from 180,000 to under 3,000. That's not a typo. 3,000. And here's the kicker. Alabama is still operating under that same 1901 Constitution today. The longest constitution in the world, at over 400,000 words. The thing is literally longer than the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy. Sir, I think it might be time for a rewrite. Then came the boll weevil. In 1915, this little Mexican beetle started chewing its way across the Cotton Belt. And by the early 1920s, it had wrecked Alabama and Mississippi's entire agricultural economy. And here's the part you can't make up. The town of Enterprise, Alabama actually built a monument to the boll weevil in 1919. A 13-foot statue of a Greek goddess holding a giant bug above her head, with a plaque thanking it for forcing the town to plant peanuts instead of cotton. Sir, you put up a statue of a bug. That's still in the town square. You can go visit it. Anyway, while Alabama was honoring its bug overlord, hundreds of thousands of black Americans were leaving in what historians call the Great Migration. Between 1916 and 1970, roughly 6 million black Americans left the South. Both states lost a huge chunk of their workforce, their tax base, and their cultural lifeblood. And what did the political class do in response? Double down on Jim Crow. By the time the New Deal rolled around in the 1930s, Alabama and Mississippi were dead last in just about everything. Last in literacy, last in income, last in life expectancy. Roosevelt himself called the South the nation's #1 economic problem. And while World War II finally pulled the country out of the Depression, when it came to civil rights, the post-war years were just the calm before the storm. 'Cause by the 1950s, the civil rights movement was rolling. The Supreme Court ruled school segregation unconstitutional in Brown v. Board on May 17, 1954. Rosa Parks, a 42-year-old seamstress, refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus on December 1, 1955. 4 days later, the Montgomery bus boycott began. A 26-year-old pastor named Martin Luther King Jr. stepped up to lead it, and the modern civil rights movement was officially on. But the response from Alabama and Mississippi wasn't, "Oh, you're right, let's fix this." It was, "Absolutely not." 'Cause in 1962, an Air Force veteran named James Meredith tried to enroll at the University of Mississippi as the first black student in the school's history. Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett went on statewide television and personally pledged to block him. President Kennedy had to send 31,000 federal troops, marshals, and National Guardsmen to Oxford, Mississippi to enforce a federal court order. 31,000. To get one student into one school. But Meredith walked into class. And a year later, he graduated with a political science degree. What a legend. But the most theatrical showdown of the entire era was about to happen 200 miles east on a hot summer morning in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. It was June 11, 1963. The University of Alabama, a red brick building called Foster Auditorium, and 2 black students, Vivian Malone, 20 years old, and James Hood, 19, were trying to register for summer classes. They had every legal right to be there. A federal court had already ordered the university to admit them. But Governor George Wallace had spent his entire first 6 months in office promising one thing: that when the day came, he would personally stand in the schoolhouse door and stop them. So that's exactly what he did. Wallace flew in from Montgomery that morning. He took up a position behind a wooden podium directly in front of the auditorium doors. Reporters from every major network in the country pressed in around him, television cameras rolling live. The temperature on campus that day climbed past 95 degrees. Wallace stood there in a dark suit, sweating, lips pressed thin, surrounded by Alabama state troopers in tan uniforms. Then, a black government sedan pulled up. Out stepped a tall, balding man in a gray suit. United States Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach, sent personally by Robert F. Kennedy. Katzenbach walked across the pavement, climbed 3 concrete steps, and stopped about 3 feet from the podium. He carried a written proclamation from the President of the United States. Katzenbach asked Wallace to step aside and obey the federal court order. Wallace held up his hand. Then, in his slow Alabama drawl, he read a 5-minute prepared speech about states' rights, calling the federal government's actions an illegal and unwarranted action. Katzenbach stood there, listened, didn't move. When Wallace finished, Katzenbach looked him square in the eye and said, "From the outset, Governor, all of us have known that the final chapter of this history will be the admission of these students." And then, Katzenbach turned around and walked back to the car. The standoff seemed to be over. But it wasn't. 'Cause now the second act began. President John F. Kennedy, watching all of this from the Oval Office, signed Executive Order 1111. He federalized the Alabama National Guard. The same guard that had taken its orders from George Wallace just minutes before now took its orders from the President of the United States. 4 hours later, Brigadier General Henry Graham of the Alabama National Guard, in full uniform, walked up to Wallace's podium. He was an Alabama man, a Wallace appointee, and he was now under federal orders. He saluted the governor. Then he said, "Quietly, sir. It is my sad duty to ask you to step aside under the orders of the President of the United States." Wallace stood frozen for a moment. Then he gave one final statement to the cameras. And he stepped aside. Vivian Malone and James Hood walked through those doors and registered for class. The schoolhouse door had been opened. Wallace had lost. But in the most disturbing way, he had also won. 'Cause that single image of him at the podium beamed across the country, and overnight, he became the most famous segregationist in America. Within a year, he was running for president. That same night, just hours after the standoff, President Kennedy went on national television and gave one of the most important speeches of his presidency. He called civil rights a moral issue, as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. 5 months later, Kennedy was gone. But the bill he announced that night eventually became the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the next big push came in 1965 with a planned voting rights march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. The first attempt, on March 7th, was halted on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, named, by the way, after a Confederate general who'd also been a Grand Dragon of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan. Yeah, that's who they named the bridge after. The footage from that day was televised. 48 million Americans saw it. The country was disgusted. President Lyndon Johnson went on national television and said the words no Southern politician had said out loud in 100 years: "We shall overcome." 5 months later, on August 6, 1965, Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. So the legal architecture of Jim Crow finally came down. But the underlying poverty, the underlying inequality, that stayed. And it stayed for the next 60 years. 'Cause here's the part that really stinks. After all that struggle, after all that blood, after all that change, Alabama and Mississippi still finished dead last on almost every chart that matters. Mississippi has the lowest median household income in the United States, at around $52,000 a year. Alabama is in the bottom 5. Mississippi has the highest poverty rate in the country, at over 18%. Alabama is in the bottom 10. Mississippi has the worst infant mortality rate in the United States. Alabama isn't far behind. Mississippi consistently ranks 50th in K-12 education. Alabama hovers in the high 40s. The two states have the lowest life expectancy in the country, with parts of the Mississippi Delta where men live shorter lives than men in some developing countries. Yikes. Oh, and modern political corruption? Off the charts. Alabama gave us the Health South scandal in 2003, where CEO Richard Scrushy and his executives were caught running a $2.7 billion accounting fraud out of Birmingham. Scrushy somehow beat the criminal fraud charges, then immediately got convicted on bribery charges in a separate case involving the former governor of Alabama, Don Siegelman. Both went to federal prison. Mississippi, not to be outdone, gave us the 2020 welfare scandal, where roughly $77 million in federal funds meant for the poorest people in the poorest state in America was instead funneled into things like a volleyball stadium at the University of Southern Mississippi, partly through retired NFL quarterback Brett Favre. Yes, that Brett Favre. Sir, what are you doing? 'Cause at this point, you're not even being subtle. But here's the cherry on top of the entire century-and-a-half-long collapse. In 1995, Mississippi finally got around to ratifying the 13th Amendment, which had been adopted by the rest of the United States way back in 1865. The state then forgot to actually file the paperwork with the federal government. For another 18 years, the 13th Amendment was not officially recognized in the state of Mississippi until February 7, 2013. I'm not making that up. They were 148 years late. Sheesh. Hence the phrase, thank God for Mississippi. Whenever Alabama ranks 49th, at least somebody's 50th. And whenever Mississippi catches a tiny break, the punchline writes itself. But in the end, Alabama and Mississippi didn't just finish last on every chart. They became the proving ground for whether American democracy actually meant what it said. 'Cause these two states, for all their statistical pain, gave the world Muddy Waters, B.B. King, Hank Williams, and Aretha Franklin. They gave us Faulkner and Harper Lee and Eudora Welty. They gave us Rosa Parks, Vivian Malone, John Lewis, and Fannie Lou Hamer. The numbers say what they say. But the people who actually live in Alabama and Mississippi, who have endured generations of bad governance and economic abandonment, who built cathedrals of music and literature and faith out of the hardest soil in America, those people are something else entirely. Two states that have spent 200 years at the bottom of the chart, but somehow at the top of almost every list of what actually makes America worth fighting for. God bless the South, man. Y'all deserve better.